Okay, Carter here, just outside the Joplin Log Cabin in Knapp Heritage Park, smack dab in the middle of beautiful downtown Arlington, Texas. Welcome to another Arlington Time Capsule. We're going to tour Knapp Heritage Park. It won't take long, but here's a quick preview. Over many years, the Arlington Historical Society found itself the owner of several historic log cabins, eventually refurbishing and relocating them here in Knapp Heritage Park on West Front Street. Information about how to tour the small little park, you can even rent it for events like family reunions, will be included in the closing credits, so stick around a while. When you're here, don't forget to say hello to the park's resident colony of feral but neutered watch cats. Just don't try to pick one up. Do that and you just really won't like what happens next. Let's start where I am, the Joplin Log Cabin. It's right behind me. It's mostly made of eastern cross timbers, oaks, and mesquites. George Washington himself built it in 1863. Okay, don't get too excited. That's cotton gin owner and rancher George Washington Joplin. He built it near the Johnson Stagecoach Station about 5 miles south of downtown, living in it with his wife and several kids. It was the Comanche country back then. Must have been a really crowded cabin. Just a word about building log cabins. It's never easy, but it's particularly difficult when you're on the prairie as Arlington is. The city is split east and west between the Grand Prairie and the eastern cross timber. The builder has to find trees, trim them, and then tow them to the build site if he's on the prairie with horses or mules. Arlington has plenty of trees, but they're mostly in the western part of town. It's also a problem that the size of the trees is inconsistent. They tend not to be too tall, so you'll often find log cabins around here with each row made up of more than one tree trunk portion. It takes a lot of mud and straw chinking to seal up the sides from drafts. The roof is another construction nightmare. Builders using hammers and chisels will have to split logs lengthwise and then sort of make shingles. There was no such thing as tar paper back in the early 1850s, so roofs tended to leak. So they make the roof with shingles, then cover it with a mix of dirt and leaves, constantly fixing problems with new shingles. Most of the time, the original floor was dirt, eventually to be replaced with planking. They typically used leather for door hinges, but glass for windows was a luxury, plus making a spot for a window in a log cabin really complicates the construction logistics. But back to this cabin. Eventually, Joplin's daughter, Jane, and her husband, blacksmith Z.T. Malier, moved into the little cabin with several children. Decades later, it was moved here. Lots of these little cabins had small sleeping or storage lofts above, where I'm guessing, since these structures aren't insulated, the sleeping was hot in summer, smoky if the stove was lit, or really cold when that Texas norther blew in. Lots of blankets would be required. While you're reviewing the inside of the cabin, you may have seen some unfamiliar technology, the technology of the 1800s, which is another good reason to tour this little park. For example, do you know how a spinning wheel works? No, me either. Here's our 1800s techie expert, Bob Pruitt, with further enlightenment.
Spinning wheels convert fibers like wool, cotton, or flax to yarn, a coarse, heavy thread. The first yarn was made by hand. Just grab a bundle of fiber, say cotton or wool, start twisting it together with your fingers and wrap that yarn around a stick. It's pretty slow. Somebody probably in India around 500 AD decided they had to speed up this process. They came up with the first version of the spinning wheel. Most of us today have never even seen a spinning wheel work, except maybe in the movies. And when I saw them in the films, I originally thought the new thread itself was being carried along somehow on the big wheel. Well, it isn't. The wheel is connected to a much smaller round bobbin with something equivalent to heavy cord. Every turn the wheel makes, the bobbin turns several times faster as the wool or cotton held in your hands is twisted into thread or cord. Now you know what the expression handmade clothes really means.
Thanks, Bob. I wonder how long it would take to spin enough thread with the spinning wheel to make this shirt. Okay, let's move on to another of the cabins. This is the Watson cabin, which architecturally would be commonly referred to as a dog run or dog trot cabin. It's really two cabins with a common porch and a breezeway in the middle, a dog trot. That's if you've got a dog. Typically, the kids would sleep on the side with the kitchen. That would be behind my right shoulder. Mom and Dad in the other cabin. Maybe some kids slept in the loft. I'm guessing that when the weather allowed, lots of people slept on the porch. If residents were lucky enough to have a mattress, often they'd be filled with something like corn shucks or maybe feathers. This was way before memory foam. Often, the bed would be a wood frame with a rope lacing over which blankets or a rough mattress would be thrown. Here's a shot of it. Patrick Watson built this cabin in 1855 near the current Arlington Grand Prairie northeast city line for himself, his wife Margaret, and their 6 children. After Margaret died, he remarried his wife's niece, Mary Jane. Might be a good point to say here that the average pioneer woman worked 60 to 70 hours a week and had several children, so their early demise was a fairly common occurrence. At any rate, he married his wife's niece, Mary Jane, and he and Mary Jane then had 6 more children. So I'm guessing with all that traffic, the dog trot construction came in pretty handy. Watson family descendants were still living in the home, with a few rooms added on until, believe it or not, the 1960s. The old Watson community has since been absorbed by Arlington and Grand Prairie, though there's still a Watson cemetery and a Presbyterian church. Most of that area is now the Great Southwest Industrial District. Okay, time for another technological time travel back to the era before milk was pasteurized and homogenized and most homes had a butter churn. Here's Bob again with a quick school on how to make that butter and buttermilk.
Thanks, Carter. Artificial intelligence, robotics, automation. When we're talking about the 1800s, forget all of those. This park is a reminder of how our great-great-grandparents accomplished essential tasks using simple machines and even simpler tools. While touring the park, you're likely to see 100 examples of the way things used to be done. Here's one example, the buttermilk churn, some version of which you'll find in any pioneer home. The first butter churn showed up about 700 BC. Churns have been around in one variant or another for about 25 centuries. It's how you make real butter and real buttermilk. And here's how it works. First, you've got to milk a cow. Let the raw, unhomogenized milk sit a while, and the lighter cream floats to the top. Thus the saying, the cream of the crop, or the cream rises to the top when talking about people. Agitate the milk, and the fragile membranes around the butter, fat particles, break and bits of butter start binding together. The butter floats to the top. Scoop the little chunks out and stash them into a container, kind of like this one. There was no refrigeration, so if you wanted the butter to last, you had to mix in a little salt. The liquid that was left is old-style buttermilk, which really should be called butterless milk. A naturally occurring bacteria called lactus begins a thickening of the milk that's left. Not so thick as the fermented stuff in the grocery store, but still a bit twangy. Without refrigeration, it lasts much longer than milk by itself. It's an acquired taste I've never acquired, and probably I'm not going to.
By the way, when milk is homogenized, the cream doesn't rise to the top anymore. All those buttery particles are broken up. No charge for that little schooling lesson. But speaking of schools, let's head over to the 112-year-old North Side School. Okay, time to go back to school. Arlington had maybe 1,200 people in 1909 when the North Side School burned down. Kids had to have a school, so this schoolhouse behind me here was quickly put together and used while a new brick school was being built. Builder Joe Crawley constructed it with the proviso that when the new school opened, the building would become his property. This is what's called board and batten structure. Okay, Bob will explain it.
When milling of timber into boards became readily available, building a house became much simpler. Just construct a framework and nail up boards to cover it. Presto, much faster construction, but with an issue. What to do about that little space between each board? Boards are nailed edge to edge, and the little space between covered with a smaller board, a batten. By the way, in Old English, the word batten means to improve, which it definitely does. It's crude, but it helps keep the heat in, the cold wind and flies out. Old board and batten houses, or school buildings, don't have a lick of insulation, but the technique sufficed for the brief time it was needed. This building was used as an office for years after it was a school, and then storage building. It's still around 112 years old after being built, and it's been moved at least 3 times. Clearly, the people who built it knew what they were doing. Fortunately, a local developer, Dan Dipert, recognized the building's value and turned it over to the Historical Society.
I used to fit this desk a little less snugly. I don't know what happened. Every year the school district brings students here and they have a little show and tell class. You know the talk, hey, my kids had it tough. One of the things hard to explain was that in Frontier, Texas, paper for schoolwork would be difficult to find and expensive, which brings us to this. Bob, what is this?
The writing slate is a thin piece of hard, flat material, such as the rock, also called slate. It was used as a medium for writing, usually with something like chalk. Paper was both expensive and hard to come by in pioneer days. Where's an Office Depot when you really need one? Writing slates like this one became common in virtually every school and lots of other places, from the 1600s and even into the early 1900s. Finally beginning to disappear in the 1930s. Now you know where the expression, what's on your slate today, came from.
You might ask, why is this called Knapp Heritage Park? Well, this entire park is on Knapp family property. The little house next to the entry gate, the one behind me, was once the office of Barrister James Knapp. Knapp, a man of impressive physical proportions, is deceased now, but he's one of Arlington's local legends. Let's go inside and take a look at his office, shall we? It's now the general store. Besides being a lawyer, he was a land investor, bail bondsman, and a lover of all things related to Texas barbecue. Over the years, I made more trips to this law office, which was in what's now the general store, than I'd like to admit, because I once ran a newspaper and printing operation at which the occasional employee would misbehave in one misdemeanor or another, and because we needed them to get the paper out, I'd have to employ Knapp's services to obtain their release. He was quite efficient at doing so. But all that's quite another story, and there may be a few confidentiality issues. Knapp's old office, the one we're in now, is now sort of a general store full of some interesting historical souvenirs. Old washing machines, coffee roasters, ice tongs, early 1900s office equipment. You should check it out when you visit. Thanks for tuning in to Arlington Time Capsules. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. If you think you'd like to visit the little park someday, here's the time and schedule. Don't forget to see our other videos on Arlington history, maybe even subscribe to our channel. See you around.